Good morning, Mr. Villhauer. Thank you very much for these lovely introductory words. So you put the bar quite high, but I try to deal with it. So we are now connected to each other via Zoom. When we planned the conference, I thought, okay, it will be nice. I'm going to travel to southern Germany, but I have to say I'm not used to not being able to see the participants. I'm still working on my screen to be able to see at least a few of you, the first 15. I'm still not quite used to that, or when you give a lecture, it is quite odd to look at those black boxes instead of students' faces. But there are great advantages. As you mentioned before, you can work with bigger groups and you can work across time zones. And as I was able to see, there are many and outstanding names, so many renowned colleagues from Latin America and Asia are with us today. I'm really delighted about that. I'm probably not to see everyone here, but there will definitely be colleagues that I work with in the past. A conference that matches our time very well. That's about the alternatives to development. And when I prepared this speech, I thought, well, we're going to talk about it actually, because actually we already know everything. We know what the challenges are, and actually we know what the solutions could be. But the question is, why do we not manage to deal with it? Despite the fact that we already know a lot, I would like to talk about the major guidelines and major ideas that I came up in the past few years. I'd like to talk about them and their implementations. In the middle of the corona crisis, we really became aware that the world became the global village. We know that we are connected to each other in every situation, and we all know that if we don't manage to fight the pandemic worldwide, we won't manage to end it. Even when the next planes go into the air, the pandemic will reach us again. But it's not just about the pandemic. All major topics that humanity works on have to be worked on worldwide. There's a lot of work to do for us this year. There's the Great University Conference in Kunming, China, where we talk about the topic of well, I'd call it exploited planet. How can we save biodiversity? We talk about, we're moving towards a big event in Glasgow in November at the end of the year, where we'll talk about climate questions. So there's a lot of talking. There's even the G20, G7 summits in Europe about. So we definitely don't lack discussion, talking about problems and working on solutions, but somehow we're not really getting forward. You introduced me as the leader of the BMZ, so the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and you ask what the BMZ is about. So in 2015, we, with the entire state community of 193 states, they all agreed anonymously on a future contract, the Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals that the state community all agreed on, because they apply to everyone. There are many sub-goals, 169, and many indicators, and these goals were supposed to be achieved by 2030, but when you take a look at what has happened so far, we will notice very quickly that we are lagging behind. Despite this, the SDGs are the major guidelines of the work of the BMZ, whatever department we're working in. This is our guiding agenda. The second guiding agenda that helps us, or that is our compass, are the Paris agreements concerning the climate agenda. We all know the BMZ is the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We celebrate our 60th anniversary this year. It has been the poor ministry basically for a long time, but now we cover all questions of sustainable development. So the question is why the climate agenda is so important for us. It's quite easy to answer that. The climate change is the biggest driver of poverty. We can see that, and we've got colleagues from India here and big countries that are very much concerned by climate change. They suffer from thirst and drought, so they have a lot of work to do to deal with climate change. So climate change and stopping climate change, as well as adapting to the consequences of climate change, are a major motive in our actions. So these are the major motives. We translate it into very different programs. We work intensely on the regional level. We've got regional departments. I'm the chairwoman of one of these, but we've got special initiatives on other topics as well, just like a world without hunger. 8 years ago, when we started this particular campaign, we said that we have all the resources to have a world without hunger. Let's implement it. Let's make it work. So these are many campaigns. There are many campaigns that we work on. If we take a look how it actually looks like, what have we managed? I like to say not we as BMZ, but we as the world community. How did the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that we put up in 2020, 2015, we have to say that we lagged back a lot. We haven't achieved that much in 9 years, so we just have 9 years left, and we have the work cut out for us. People who work in, who live in extreme poverty has risen. The number of these people has risen for the first time since 1998. The number was actually decreasing before. We have to expect that more than 70 million people will become poorer and will suffer from poverty because of the pandemic, because they can't work anymore. And this is particularly the case in sub-Saharan African and South Asia. So poverty rate is probably going to rise to 8.9%. So when I talk about the poverty rate, I'm talking about the extreme. I'm talking about extreme poverty. We also have work poverty. Means that many people, because of the global lockdowns, you're all well aware of them, had suffered from these sanctions. People weren't able to go to work within 4 hours. That was an absolute catastrophe for quite a lot of people. There's barely any places in the world where there's such a unemployment insurance the way we know it, and many people who just fell into the situation. In the pandemic, we acted very quickly on social security systems in South America, For instance, there was a study that the government really tried to build up social security systems with transfer payments, but after a little more than 1 year of the pandemic, we know that poverty rates spiked. Taking a look at hunger, we know that around 2 billion people still suffer from nourishment insecurity, and this rate is ever increasing even during the pandemic. We know that this insecurity, uncertainty, people who do not know whether they can have 3 meals a day throughout an entire year, but suffer from hunger period. We've got about 700 million people who are surely malnourished, and this number is increasing. We have to think about that. This number is increasing because of the pandemic, and also I have to mention that it is connected to increasing conflicts in Yemen, in Sudan. We are afraid that will happen in Afghanistan as well. So these are unfortunate trends that in 10, 15 years over that course, we managed to have positive trends, but we saw that our challenges have risen. The health is one of the sustainable goals as well. We had a lot of achievements in that area. For instance, between 2000 and 2017, the death rate of mothers decreased by 38%. We managed fighting HIV and malaria. So when we put a lot of effort in it, we can achieve things. We can definitely say that from starting in 2000, where there would be the Millennium Development Goals were passed up until now. When we take a look at that, we see that when you put effort in it, when you have a focus, things can happen. And in the pandemic, we can see that quite clearly. Health systems are still very weak. Despite the fact that we have made major progress in fighting polio, for instance, but the system in total are not made to systematically deal with health problems and health crises, let alone people having health insurance that like the one we have right here. This isn't to be taken for granted. With the BMZ, we are building a health insurance with 500 million participants. In India, that's quite a lot, where people at least have a basis and have security when they go to hospital. So things are working, but health systems are still not capable enough to deal with regular health problems, let alone with what we're dealing with right now. Education, another major topic for many people in this world. We know that at least 2 years ago, when we took the last figures, 260 million kids between 6 and 70 years do not go to school at all. And we know that that in many countries where children go to school, they have to leave after year 5. So they're not familiar with basic mathematics or can't read a coherent text. So when if children go to school, it is still the case in many countries that they have not received enough education and cannot perform what children in Germany can perform when they leave school. 85% of teachers are educated, but 15% are not. So when you take a look at Africa, we can see that only 64% of teachers were trained. We have managed to raise the number of children in schools, but the quality of education worldwide is not on a level that is absolutely necessary to deal with the challenges of this world. Well, health, gender equality, another major goal of the SDGs. Ms. Keller is smiling a little. I think she has an opinion on that too. So she knows that we are very far away from that goal. There are good developments in that area. So the number of child marriages has decreased, especially in South Asia. So there's a positive development in that area. Genital mutilation is still decreasing, but still 200 million women are concerned by that. So what we live through is in the pandemic is that schools are closing down. So that throws children back on their education. But in many countries, the schools are the place where children get warm meals, hot meals, and that is not possible at the moment. So that's absolutely dramatic. So there's surely still a lot to do. The number of women in parliament has increased between 10 and 20%, from between 10 and 20% to 25%. Also, manager positions, number of women is increasing, but it's 28% worldwide. So that's far away from 50%. Gender equality, there's still so much to work on. And the pandemic really keeps women at home. And I can see that with my young colleagues, because they are female colleagues that are home doing the homeschooling. And if I meet anyone at the office, it's men. So I think that this is a topic worldwide. Water, one of the major topics that we're currently working on, this fresh water supply with clean drinking water that has improved, but we're still far away from the fact that everyone in this world gets good access to water, but 4 billion people still do not have that access. Sanitary and sewage, and that also falls into that category. Those of you who travel a lot do know that the condition of rivers in many countries is remarkably bad. Additional to water, and this is quite a current topic, water resources are so thoughtful that they do trigger or might trigger conflicts, even military conflicts. In the past few weeks, we observed the discussion between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia concerning Nile water. I don't know if you managed to hear about the media coverage. In Ethiopia, they've got the GERD, the Great Renaissance Dam, where they a lot of Ethiopians have contributed to this dam. It's a project of national pride in Ethiopia, but filling this dam leads to great problems with the countries in the lower parts of the river, such as Egypt, who came up with threats and thought about entering a war if there isn't an agreement on dividing and on sharing the water. We have heard about similar conflicts in other countries. There are commissions who work on an agreement on interest, but this is always connected to very strong interests. So there are many bigger river regimes where we have to really take a very close look what it means to having to fight for water because you do not have enough water. 100 or 1,000 years old water regimes are points of conflict. We need solutions in this area. How do we deal with our natural resources that an ever-increasing population can deal with the water and has a basis for living? Now, talking about resources, let's talk about energy as well. Where there's still a huge hunger for energy in this world. The world is growing in Africa. In 2050, there will be twice as many people living there as right now. Alone, in Africa alone, there are 400 coal plants planned or being built. Do you know what that means for climate? Do you know how much energy twice as many people in Africa will consume during their lifetime? So in the energy sector, we not just in Europe, worldwide, we need a huge change in getting energy and in energy consumption. Energy efficiency is a part of that. We need to change from fossil fuels to renewable energies of any type. We have to pump so much into that and research in implementation in energy change. One of the major topics of the BMZ with bigger countries such as China, who's one of the biggest emitters, India as well, Africa, I've mentioned before, will become one. This is to be expected. And so if these future demonstrations can go on as much as the one. There's the one in Berlin. It's Friday, I think. Yeah, so it's one. There's one Friday for Future demonstration in Berlin. So whatever we do in Germany, it will just be a small contribution to the world climate. So we have to listen to different kind of debates, and when we debate with our partner governments, I can't really argue with them. When they say that the smaller nations did not contribute to climate change as much. But there are many people in China as well who understood that they cannot retreat, they have to do something as a change. It's one of the few points where China and the USA agree on currently. Many things that we do in the BMZ has something to do with energy and clean energy and energy efficiency, so that we can handle climate change, that we can take out this driver for poverty. So these are things that we're working on.
I do not like to talk about unemployment or the access to the internet because I mentioned it before. The access to digital media is still a topic, an issue all over the world. Inequality. Mr. Villhauer, you have to tell me if this gets too long. Well, we have a certain time frame, but we need to have some room for discussion. But I would like to talk about inequality. So I talked of income poverty that we are still seeing, and it's growing. It's growing again, but this is also connected to inequality. At the same time, my minister is quite radical. You probably know him from different interviews. He says, just look at the gap, how big it is. See all the assets that are collected on one side. So looking at the income, we know that 40% of the world population generate 10% of the world income. But if you take a look at the gap, or did we see that it's much bigger than that? And the minister always quotes the boss of Amazon. It's he grew wealthier by 17 to 14%, 100, but 17 to 20 billion dollars. So it's the inequality, and it affects us too. We've seen that in 2015 with the issue of with the topic of refugees. That was due to the conflicts all across the world in Syria, but these streams of migrants could have been predicted. So if we have certain, there are 3 billion people that are affected by that. So there needs to be like some kind of wealth for these people, and it could have been predicted. It sounds simple, but it's one of the most difficult topics to cope with. So how can you get people to participate in prosperity, and that gap does not get even bigger? So, and that's also has something to do with policies, also with goals, you said, and it has something to do with not automatically excluding people from all chances. I talked about education, but health is also part of it in order to participate in gaining prosperity, that we are producing in societies. It's not a problem of growth, because there was enormous growth all over the world economically, but the profits from that growth were not distributed equally among all people. So I'm really strongly convinced if we accept something like that, and unequal distribution of goods, this will be a great burden for our world. That's quite clear. There are so many things we could talk about: humans, waste, plastic, our use of resources, degraded soils, talked about water. I mentioned biodiversity, all those important topics. Ecosystems are breaking down. So all these big issues, one big issue that is in my responsibility is tropic forest. Brazil is part of my portfolio, so I do not have to tell you a lot of things about it, because you can read it on the newspaper every day. Mr. Bolsonaro told Mr. Biden that he's about to stop it, and then the budget of the environmental or the Ministry of Environment is cut by 20%, so 25% even. So how can we protect the forest? That's a big issue, and our partners tell us, we're talking to Indonesia about palm oil, and they are part of the discussion too. So they say, well, that's all sounds great, but we are offering environmental services, and we are protecting these forests at the forest in the Amazon is almost as big as Europe, and we're protecting them also from criminals. So they say, why don't you plant trees? That's what I heard from Brazil, but we have to stick with this discussion also with the countries that have these big forests, Congo, for instance, Indonesia, Brazil, those are the big countries, or the countries with the big forests. And of course, they having debates in their countries too, especially in Brazil. And in many places, there is also insight. And on the other hand, there are arguments that I'm discussing all the time with the ministers for the environment, but we have to make use of these resources, help us to make use of the woods without deforesting them. So this is what the Minister for the Environment of Brazil always calls it, like in doing that in a biological way, because when the people, if the people gain some money with the forest, then that would be great thing, but we need new concepts, better technology, better value chains. And another topic that I did not touch upon yet is that are the delivery chains, the supply chains, which is also a question of justice, of equality. And this is something that is really something we are observing very closely. So this is really a whole palette of things we have to do. So we do not have all the details, but not all the technologies available, but the big topics are on the table and there are goals stuck to them, and we have to do it. This is the decisive message that's essential. That's, we all have to do it, not only big politics. Maybe I go to that point because I could go on and on with all the big topics, but I think we should take a little bit of time just to talk about all of this. Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Warning. This was really a very impressive list of things. As an economist, I am happy that you talked about asymmetry, about distribution of assets. And of course, you pointed out that there are indicators. So how can we do that? How can we measure sustainable development? You talked about education. How can we get a better understanding of this topic? So thank you for your presentation. And a lot of questions came in the chat. So don't worry about the chat. You don't have to have a look at it because I already read all the questions. So how many of the claimed projects like the dam in Ethiopia or other projects you mentioned are supported by KfW? So how can we handle this in a coherent way? Should I answer right away? Yes, I asked a question and you answer right away. So is that okay with you, Ms. Warning? Yes, you're welcome. Well, coal plants of fossil energy, well, in the past 10 years, we've learned a lot about it. The KfW is not allowed to support a energy project using fossil fuels. We talked about an Indonesian coal plant only lately, which should be retrofitted in order to modernize it and reduce CO2 emissions. And with that, if we would have done that, we would have prolonged its life cycle. And at the same time, CO2 emissions would have been reduced, but we opted against it. We have a very clear line, and our minister's not amused with things like that. So he's not refurbishing any coal plants. So the last one that I witnessed to get the support was in 2018 in Mongolia, but there are no new there is no new financing of any fossil fuel plants. So the dam in Ethiopia was not financed by KfW. It was a national collection of money, crowdfunded, so to speak, in that was Ethiopian project. They said we do the financing ourselves, and dams, of course, this is a very huge issue. How can dams be financed, and where should they be? Is this ecological? How big should they be? All these things need to be considered. So there were a lot of debates. Also, our commissioner or the Chancellor's Commissioner for Africa said that there should be another dam in the Congo, 5 times the size of the Yangtze Dam. These debates are still ongoing, and we have to be very aware of that. And we are not, or KfW is not financing any kind of dam or fossil fuel plants anywhere in the world. Maybe based on agreements from 2015, that was the last time we supported something like that. So we are still learning a lot of things. Yes, I think the ministry is doing a great job, but another question came in on coherency on policy. Richard Hartmann asked or said those are just nice words of the ministry, but especially on the level of the EU, things get blocked. So can we, how do you see it? Do we have to listen what the EU says, or what about the relationship between the EU and Germany? Yes, that also was a huge issue, especially in the presidency that just ended. But we are all watching this in the daily news, but being more coherent between what the member states want and what the EU makes would be reasonable in many segments. Talking about trade, supply chains, this is where the Germans are getting busy, and EU is catching up, or our relationship to China, which is not finally clarified, and debates are still ongoing. EU itself is doing much too less for African issues, African questions. If you take a look at the 7 years finance plan, then there are not too much funds. So what we wished for in Germany is not being considered. So just tell you what happens in our ministry. A lot of things EU member states are doing in with respect to development is done in the countries, not in the EU. So colleagues are trying to do things in their countries. So that this is difficult at times because there are a lot of debates and everyone has his own imagination, and they have their guidelines from their capitals, and then colleagues in Addis Ababa try to get that all aligned, and that's not simple. So from Brussels, there is a lot of paperwork, but these papers need to become reality. So maybe that was where the pandemic was helpful. There is a team Euro approach right now, because we found in the pandemic, and you all know that we all panicked, also the whole nation, and then we found that this also isn't the way to go. So we strengthened the EU. Whether that was a good thing when it came to get all the vaccination is another story, but initiatives came out of that, and that set a push. of how can we do something on an operative level. But I see there is more headroom, more that we can do. So also within Germany, not only in the EU, all the ministries need to be coordinated, and there might be some conflicts involved. And Ms. Enskusa asked about the federal level. So thank you for your presentation. How do the other ministries interfere with development, focusing on emerging countries compared to crisis areas, compared to migration and refugees? So isn't that their field of action very limited?
Würde ich erstmal, nein.
No.
Das würde ich als pauschale Schlussfolgerung so nicht akzeptieren wollen.
No, I cannot accept it as such. Of course, different ministries have their resource, and of course, they need to be aligned, and there are debates on which way to go, and sometimes they conform, talking about ecosystems and the environment. There is unison, just discussing strategies, saying we do not discuss with the Brazilians because they do not do a good job, or yes, we love working with you. There was a debate that we had going on several weeks, and then there are interests that are opposing. We see that especially with the supply chains, Mr. Peil and Mr. Müller have different interests than my ministry. So there are meetings trying to get all these different strategies and approaches together. And we had that only last week. We had the first reading in the parliament. So it's not that politicians agree all the time, because that would be strange too, because there are different interests involved.
Das hat die Kollegin sehr genau beschrieben. Es gibt tatsächlich.
My colleague described this quite accurately. There are different perspectives on countries. So
ganz klaren Blick auf die Frage.
Takes a look at the migration in Asian countries, for instance, and then it comes to the forecasts. It's a project called Perspective Home. So we try to give a perspective to migrants that are illegally in the country to make a living in their home country, to found startups, and that was a long discussion. Believe me, it's not self-evident how this goes down. Should we do that? Could we do that? Is it our responsibility? Are we now a function of the Ministry of the Interior? So these kind of debates are going on in the background. We need to have these discussions. I think that they are not a bad thing. It's just self-explanatory to do that. But in with respect to development cooperation, I would wish for something like that. We talked about environmentally safe products, but about development safe products or approaches, and what's the role of the churches in that as a moral instance, as someone who has the vision. So this is also a task for our society. So what we do in politics reflects the interests of society to a certain degree, and don't underestimate that. Before I entered the ministry, I could not imagine how much input we get from the society, letters, emails, petitions, requests. So there is a strong activity coming from the society in this country. And that's a good thing. But for some topics that are important for humanity, even pivotal for humanity in the course of the next 50 years, we need even stronger challenges coming from the society. So just challenges. Yes, I think there will be further challenges in the future. You talked about the supply chain law and all the conflicts in this regard. There were other questions in this respect, but I leave them out. But Mr. Wagner asked, what about the inequality of distribution? What about partition and gaining prosperity or wealth? What about tax equality? Are there any goals? Yes, there are. So I tell you something about our planning process that then takes me to the initiatives. So we have negotiations between the governments, government to government negotiations. So we ask, can you offer, what can we offer? So in preparation of these meetings, and if it's about the distribution, the assignment of our budget, then there is that one constant thing. There are different criteria that we need to respect for the assignment. So how much money goes to which country? And one of the criteria is the tax ratio, how
ausgeprägt und wie gut aufgebaut sind die Steuersysteme in den Ländern.
Expressed how well formed are the tax systems in the individual countries. Is there a tax that allows for state expenses to be controlled? So I talked about the informal sector. So it's not with the poor people. In fact, it's with the better situated. So they have an income tax in these. So how high is the income of that state? This is a good way to see how we assign our funds. And then we start debating. Then we ask, can we help you? It's not that we say you have to increase taxes or have a new tax system, but we ask them whether they need our help, and it's regional. It's not about global projects. There are only a few of them, but for us, it's a point on the agenda in negotiations to ask how far can you get your own people or the own forces in the country to do that. And we are doing a quite good job for these cheap loans. So not the taxpayers' money is going to Peru or India, but we are offering them loans that need to be paid back. And there is a huge own proportion that they have to pay also in the big economies. So yes, we implement projects where we in the finance ministry try to do that. Like Afghanistan, for instance, I talked to the Afghan finance minister yesterday about the question of how tax ratio in Afghanistan can be increased. So with all the poverty figures that are really high with 70%, of course, still there is a possibility to collect taxes. So this is what the government does. So yes, these are part, these topics are part of our negotiations. So there are another 4 interesting questions. So let me put it like this. This is about economic structures and capital streams. So do you have a possibility to influence the German economy in an ecological direction, or maybe controlling the empowerment of women in these countries? Well, to start with, if all the donor countries that are organized in the OECD, we have about 145 billion dollars official development funds. We cannot save the world with that money. That can only be an impulse. That, of course, may save lives in some places, in Yemen, for instance, but this is not going to change if the way we run the economy is changing or the economy is growing. And that's why we try to come up with a concept that involves the German industry in order to trigger investments that are socially and ecologically sustainable and going beyond the investment when it comes to the effect they have. So projects with Siemens, there's that one contract with Egypt where they build huge plants, and of course you need trained workers to run these plants in Egypt, which is difficult because there are no well-trained workers that could bear something like the Internet of Things in their companies. So what they made is we are co-financing a school together with Siemens, and Siemens is training technicians on a level that they think is enough, and they do it for 35,000 students, which is much more than they need. But this is just a small example, but it's an example where we can say that German know-how, German economic know-how is helpful to build something in the country. And it's also a benefit for Siemens and also for the country, because they have people that are trained on a German level, and that's 7 times more students than Siemens needs. So we have special programs talking about safe nutrition, and we have a same agreement for the economy. There are hundreds of projects all over the world, and we have a development fund for 1 billion for Africa, which is supposed to trigger exactly investments like these.
Es ist übrigens immer noch zu wenig.
And this is still not enough. It's clear. That's work in progress. So we should take this serious. So just to summarize this, there are 2 really concrete subjects, like the education in school and COVID. So just getting those questions together, and then we can talk about the general things at the end. So education, Ms. Elisabeth Koif asked the question, what's the desire for school education and knowledge that cannot be taught in schools? How can we get that together? Because the tradition is important, traditional knowledge is important, so it should be strengthened. And another second aspect is concerning Corona. So fighting poverty and global health is so important to the federal government. Why don't they support the initiative of President Biden to
diese beiden Fragen, Bildungsaspekt und Corona. Vielleicht können Sie sich dazu noch mal ganz schnell so nebenbei.
Zum Thema
talking about indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, extra scholastic curriculums. So we made the decision that everything that is necessary for formal education will be implemented through UN structures. So we do not have that in our portfolio. It's third level education. This is what we talk about. And of course, vocational training. You'll find that in almost every country supported by us. And we get a lot of requests from everywhere. They said, well, you have sort of like the gold standard in education, so we need that too. So this is where we are very active. The other projects are not really educational projects, but for example, supporting women or making sure food supply is given. So how can we implement that in our projects? How can we, so these are not really part of these sectors. So we have some programs that are about to come to an end when it comes to conventional education, because there are internationally operating organizations that do that. I don't know whether it's I'm the right person to talk about PRIPS, but okay, Python took a position, so there will be a discussion. I think I'm hearing a few noises about that debate. That's all I can tell you about it. Well, hopefully these noises become louder and become real sounds. So let me end this with 3 questions that broaden the horizon, so to speak. So this is great for the end of this part of the session. So about the term growth, should we just see that more critically, maybe seeing other criteria too. So this is the basic setting. Second question was global responsibility is right on our doorstep. So the task of having global education is part of a more just world. So domestic education, how important is it within the ministry? So that's maybe gives you sort of a perspective. And the last thing is we have the knowledge and the solutions. So why do you think, isn't there a change in any way? Well, do we have 3 days to answer all these questions? Well, maybe I have 2 little stories I would like to tell you in the context of education. When we had the finance crisis 2007-8, I said that in the introduction, I was head of the German Hilfswerke, which is a organization to help poor people. And I talked to Ms. Merkel, and she told us, she said, well, these growth questions, they are responsible for these problems that we are facing. And that was in 2007-8, and now we have 2021. So the debates are clear. It's not a question of growth, because we need growth. That's clear, because the number of people is growing, and a lot are not well supported. But it's about the quality of growth. What kind of quality of growth do we need? And then we have the second debate. Day before yesterday, we had a debate with the Bishops' Conference and my ministers. They had a debate that was just a small meeting, a small session, and it was exactly about the topic of growth. And my minister said, well, it's quite clear we need new concepts of a quality growth. We need a different kind of growth than we
Auch dazu wissen wir schon viel.
had so far.
Von Meadows ist vor 20 Jahren oder wann geschrieben.
So there was that book called Factor 4 from Meadows. That's was written a few years ago. So the knowledge is there. How can we generate the growth? But if growth is decreasing, like in the pandemic, of course, there are bottlenecks in the supply. So we have a growth of about 7%, which is at 4% at the moment. That's what we need in order to deal with the growing number of people and to abolish poverty. And there is that connection. But what kind of growth? This is important to us. So maybe we leave it at that and we have another conference only on that topic. So domestic work, and why aren't things changing? Well, why aren't things changing? Because it is a constant fight. Well, yes, that's true. Domestic work. This conference is co-financed by my ministry, the BMZ, from domestic work funds.
Wir haben etwa 10% unserer Mittel.
So about 10% of our funds are used for non-governmental organizations, churches, associations. It's more than 1 billion. And there is also a part which is left for domestic initiatives. And of course, the question is, do we have enough funds to do that? I think we have enough funds. Of course, my CV says that we should support our civil society within the country and abroad, because you cannot work abroad if you do not do the job domestically as a ministry for development, because otherwise you will get no donations. So this is very important to us. The minister just got the budget through a parliament and made sure that he does something special for this this department of the ministry. But yes, it is very important to us. Of course, it could be more all the time, and of course, it is always fighting for the funds, but that is obvious. But the budget is limited, and of course, you need to consider different aspects. There are a lot of lobbyists calling me from the civil society saying, well, you don't have to use my funds for that, but need to be shortened because of this. But I say, well, the budget needs to stay the same so that that the funds are assigned correctly and more easy. So this was part of the debates of the last week. Yes, of course, in total, that's correct. And of course, we support that. We should think about that funds being bigger, but of course, then that goes against other projects and needs to be settled with them. But of course, things are going on. I tried to say that in the beginning. It's not enough, though, but we also have proved that
seit Anfang der Tausender Jahre, seit 2000.
From the beginning of in the early 2000s, we started doing that, and after having implemented a proper monitoring system, we can prove that if you focus on your work, you can achieve something. So looking at the world in the 1970s and compare it to today's world, a lot of things have changed. I do not agree with this way we deal with it today, but this fatal approach. But a lot of things have changed. We can do something. Of course, I need to be an optimist in my job, but of course, there is also proof in the numbers. So I'm a little bit frustrated with the situation that we face with the pandemic and the growing conflicts and the growing streams of refugees. Those are climate refugees, pandemic. Those are the big drivers of a step back. But in the past 20, 30 years, there has been a gradual improvement. And this is something that keeps us going because we know we are not exposed to this. We are those that need to do something, you and us. So that was a very optimist approach. Thank you very much. There are so many things that we could discuss, but we need to go on with the agenda. So thank you for your input.